She was born a slave, nameless, powerless, forgotten. But on the night the Iron Fang King came to claim his throne, his wolf stopped cold. Because the scent that should have been his enemy was his fated mate. One choice will ignite a war, test the moon's will, and rewrite what it means to be free. Stay until the end, the twist will change everything. Dawn came slow to the slave yards. The air was cold enough to bite, and the sky was painted the color of old bruises. Smoke drifted from the forges and mixed with the sour scent of sweat, iron, and fear. The world here always smelled like that, a reminder that no one left without scars. Lyra bent over the trough, scrubbing a pail until her hands burned raw. The water was gray from soot. It never mattered how much she cleaned. Everything in the kennels returned to dirt in the end. She had stopped counting the days long ago. Birthdays meant nothing when you didn't even have a name until someone shouted it at you in anger. She was Lyra because an overseer once said it sounded like leash. It stuck. Most things in this place stuck: grime, bruises, and names you didn't choose. All around her, other Omegas moved silently, heads bowed. They were a blur of rags and exhaustion, thin arms and sharper eyes. Every sound, every barked order or crack of a whip, made them flinch before they could think. Lyra wasn't any different. She tried to be invisible, tried to keep her wolf small and quiet, because even the idea of defiance brought punishment. Omegas weren't meant to feel anger. They were meant to serve. That was what she told herself each morning. That, and the one thing her mother had managed to whisper before they took her away. You are not what they say you are. Those words haunted her. Because what else could she be? She was a nobody born in chains. But that morning, everything changed. The yard stirred hours before sunrise. The guards were restless. Even the overseers looked tense, their usual cruelty sharpened by fear. Whispers traveled through the ranks like wind through dry grass. He's here. The king of Ironfang. The alpha himself. Lyra froze mid-step. She had heard the stories. Every slave had. They said the Ironfang king had burned 3 rival packs to ash in a single night. They said he'd killed his own brother for treason and left the body out for the crows. Some said he didn't even have a name anymore, that it had been taken by the moon goddess herself after he won her favor in blood. Lyra didn't believe any of it. Not really. Stories were for people who had time to dream. But then, a sound reached her. Hooves on stone. The sharp, rhythmic clatter of soldiers marching in perfect step. And then she smelled it. It rolled through the camp like lightning through the rain, a scent raw and ancient, wild enough to make her heart falter.
Smoke, pine, storm, power.
Her knees nearly buckled under it. Something deep inside her, something she'd tried to bury for years, moved. Her wolf stirred, pressing against the cage of her ribs, as if recognizing something she couldn't.
No, she told herself.
Keep your head down. But when he appeared, she couldn't. He dismounted slowly, the movement smooth, almost predatory. His armor was dark steel, dulled by battle, and a heavy cloak hung from his shoulders. He didn't need to speak to command the space around him. The soldiers simply stopped, waiting for his signal. The king's eyes swept the yard, cold, searching. They were silver, but not the dull color of metal. They glowed, faintly, like moonlight reflected in a blade. And then his gaze landed on her. It was like being struck. A weight. A recognition. Every instinct screamed look away, but her body wouldn't obey. He frowned, just a twitch, and the smallest growl escaped his throat. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Something older. His wolf stirred just as hers did. The overseer noticed his hesitation and hurried forward. Your Majesty, she's nothing. A kennel Omega. Born here, no lineage. The king didn't answer. He kept walking, slow, deliberate, each step echoing through the yard. When he reached her, the world seemed to narrow until there was nothing but his shadow and the pounding of her pulse. He stopped inches away. The air around him was charged, the kind that came before lightning struck. His scent filled her lungs, intoxicating, terrifying. Her wolf pressed harder, clawing to get free. The king's hand lifted, gloved fingers brushing dirt from her cheek. It was the lightest touch, but it burned. Then his expression shifted. The silver in his eyes brightened. His jaw tensed. "Mine," he said. The word wasn't loud, but it rolled through the yard like thunder. Every wolf there felt it, the binding power behind it. An alpha's claim. Gasps rippled through the ranks. The overseer dropped to his knees, stammering something about mistakes and mercy. But the king didn't hear. His gaze was locked on her, as if the rest of the world no longer existed. Lyra couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She wanted to deny it, to say it wasn't possible, that he had to be wrong. But her wolf was already howling inside her chest, wild with recognition. And that terrified her most of all, because no one in the slave yard survived being noticed. And if the king of Iron Fang had truly found his mate in an Omega slave, someone would bleed before the sun set. And it might just be her. The yard remained frozen long after the king spoke that single word. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lyra felt the weight of every stare, every heartbeat. She wanted to vanish into the dirt, but the king's gaze pinned her in place. That silver light in his eyes wasn't human. It was the light of the moon itself, reflected in the body of a man who'd forgotten how to be gentle. When he finally turned from her, the spell broke. The overseer collapsed into frantic bows. Guards scattered to make room as the king barked an order, sharp, commanding, absolute. "Take her from this place. She belongs to the palace now." The words didn't feel real. Lyra's stomach twisted as rough hands grabbed her arms. No, wait. But her protest was lost beneath the clatter of armor and the growl of wolves shifting at the edges of the camp. The king's soldiers bound her wrists, not cruelly but firmly, and led her away from the only world she'd ever known. They marched for hours. Past the forge fires, past the wooden fences, up through the narrow mountain pass that overlooked the valley of Iron Fang. The air grew cleaner there, pine and snow replacing smoke and ash. Lyra had never seen so much sky. She kept her eyes down anyway. By dusk they reached the outer walls of the palace. It rose from the rock like something carved by gods, towers of black stone, banners snapping in the wind, every inch humming with power. Wolves in silver armor patrolled the gates, their eyes reflecting the torchlight. When they led her through the main archway, she half expected to wake up. The floors were marble. The air was warm. The scent of roasted meat and candle smoke filled the hall. She hadn't felt warmth in years. A woman waited there, tall, dressed in dark green, her gaze sharp. "The king wants her cleaned," she said to the guards. "And fed."
Carefully.
"The others are not to speak to her." Lyra opened her mouth to ask why, but the woman's eyes silenced her. They put her in a small chamber near the servants' wing. The bath steamed. The food was more than she'd ever seen in one place. She ate slowly, afraid it might vanish if she blinked. But comfort brought no peace. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him again. The king, the way his voice had wrapped around that single word, mine. It didn't make sense. She was nothing. He was the most powerful alpha in the realm. Mates were said to be chosen by the moon goddess, but surely even the goddess didn't make mistakes this cruel. When the door finally opened, she thought it was another servant. It wasn't. He stood there, no armor now, just dark clothes that made him look even taller. The silver in his eyes was softer, but the power behind it was the same. "Do you know what you are to me?" he asked quietly. Lyra shook her head. "A mistake." The word slipped out before she could stop it. A faint smile touched his mouth, one that didn't reach his eyes.
"No."
"A promise." He stepped closer. "Your scent called to me across the valley. The bond doesn't lie." "I'm an Omega," she said. "A slave." His voice was calm, but his jaw tightened. "You were a slave. You are mine now by right of the moon." Lyra's pulse raced. She wanted to hate the way those words stirred something fierce and trembling inside her. "If I refuse?" He looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but weariness. "Then I will protect you anyway. The bond doesn't ask for permission." He turned toward the door, then paused.
Rest.
Tomorrow the court will learn your name. And just like that, he was gone. Lyra sank to the floor, heart hammering. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains, carrying the sound of distant wolves. Somewhere in that wild chorus, her own soul answered back, soft, frightened, but awake. She didn't know if it was the beginning of her freedom or the start of a new kind of cage. The palace at Ironfang was beautiful the way winter was beautiful, quiet, gleaming, and full of things that could kill you if you lingered too long. By the time Lyra woke the next morning, her chamber had been filled with sunlight and the faint hum of voices outside the door. Servants moved like shadows beyond the threshold, whispering her name. She wasn't sure if it was curiosity or fear. When the door opened again, the same woman in green entered. Her bearing was soldier straight, her eyes cool and assessing. "I am Commander Varen," she said. "The king ordered me to prepare you for court."
Court.
Lyra almost laughed. She still had bruises on her wrists from the slave ropes. Varen didn't seem to expect an answer. She gestured toward a rack of clothes, a gown of silver-gray linen, simple but elegant, far too fine for someone who'd grown up in chains. "Wear this. You will stand beside the throne until dismissed. You do not speak unless the king commands it. Understand?"
Lyra nodded.
Words felt too heavy. The great hall was carved from stone that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. Banners of the Ironfang pack hung from the pillars, each marked with a wolf's head embroidered in silver thread. Every noble in the room turned to stare as she entered. She felt their eyes like claws. Some looked shocked, others angry. To them she was a scandal wrapped in rags. An omega, in a place meant for royalty. The king sat on the dais at the far end of the hall, his posture relaxed but every movement calculated. His silver gaze flicked toward her, just once. That small acknowledgement steadied her trembling legs more than any kind word could have. Varen guided her to stand a few steps behind him. The air here was different, thick with tension, with the scent of too many wolves holding back what they really thought. The first voice came from a man near the council table. "My king," he said smoothly, "forgive my curiosity, but the slaves are usually housed below, not brought into the throne room." The king's expression didn't change. "This one is not a slave." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. "She is your consort, then?" Another noble asked carefully. Lyra's throat went dry. The king's eyes stayed on the council table. "She is under my protection. That is all you need to know." The tone of his voice left no room for argument, but the glances that followed were sharper than blades. Every alpha and beta in the room was measuring her, weighing her worth, deciding if she was a threat. Hours later, when the court was finally dismissed, Lyra found herself alone again in the quiet corridor beyond the hall. The marble floor gleamed beneath her bare feet. Even her reflection looked like a stranger's. She turned a corner and nearly collided with someone. The man caught her by the shoulders to steady her. His grip was firm but not cruel. He wore the black and silver armor of the royal guard, though his face was younger than most. "You're her," he said softly, as if he'd just met a ghost. Lyra stepped back. "I'm no one." He smiled faintly. "That's what the king said once, before he became what he is." His eyes softened. "Be careful, Omega. There are wolves here who would rather see you gone than let you stand beside him." "Why tell me that?" she asked. "Because not all of us have forgotten what freedom costs." He nodded once and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor before she could ask his name. That night, the palace slept beneath a storm. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and the torches outside her window guttered in the wind. Lyra couldn't sleep. The bond she didn't want pulsed faintly in her chest, an invisible thread pulling her toward the heart of the palace. Toward him. She hated it. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she saw his silver gaze again, the way he'd looked at her not with ownership, but with recognition, as if she reminded him of something he'd lost long ago. She pressed her hands over her heart and whispered into the dark. "What have you done to me?" The storm that rolled over Ironfang that night didn't feel like weather. It felt like warning. Thunder crawled across the sky in long, echoing growls, shaking the mountains until the palace windows trembled in their frames. Lightning flashed across the courtyard, turning the rain to sheets of silver. Lyra stood at her window, watching the storm. Somewhere beyond the peaks lay the valley she'd been taken from, a patchwork of mud huts and smoke. She wondered if the others could see the same lightning, and if they thought of her at all. She told herself she didn't care. But she did. Behind her, the door opened softly. She spun around, heart hammering, but it wasn't the king this time. It was Commander Varen, her cloak still wet from patrol. "The king summons you," Varen said.
Now. Lyra hesitated.
"At this hour? The council doesn't sleep when war threatens the borders. Move quickly." They crossed the dim corridors lit only by torches, their footsteps muffled against the carpets. The air smelled of parchment and smoke. It reminded Lyra that this palace, for all its grandeur, was built to be a fortress first and home second. The council chamber sat behind a pair of massive iron doors etched with wolves. Inside, a map stretched across the table, territories marked in red and black. Several nobles leaned over it, their voices low and tense. The king stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, the noise of the room dulled, and his expression softened. Then the mask returned. "Lyra," he said, her name sounding strange on his tongue. "Come here." She obeyed before she could think. The nobles shifted uneasily. One of them, a gray-haired woman with a scar across her jaw, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, this is no place for her. The matter concerns the Eastern Rebellion." The king's eyes hardened. "The matter concerns my pack, and she is part of it." That silenced the protest, though the tension in the room thickened until it felt like trying to breathe through fog. He pointed to the map. "3 nights ago, our scouts were ambushed near the border. The rebels have a new ally, one who knows our patrol routes too well." His gaze flicked to Lyra. "You grew up near the kennels. You know the valleys beyond the wall. Did you ever hear the name Ashrend?" Lyra frowned, the name stirring something faint in her memory. "A legend," she said slowly. "They said he was a ghost who hunted the overseers that mistreated slaves." A murmur rippled through the council. The king nodded. "Not a ghost. A wolf. Once one of my own. He was exiled for treason years ago. Now he leads the rebellion." He looked back at her, voice low. "If he's moving against us, I need to know what the slaves are hearing. You might see or sense things my soldiers cannot."
Lyra blinked.
"You want me to spy? I want you to survive what's coming," he said quietly, "and help me prevent others from dying." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any order could have. He didn't speak like a ruler giving commands. He spoke like a man tired of losing people. She hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll try." A faint smile ghosted across his face. "Good. Commander Varen will see that you have what you need." Later, when the others had gone, Lyra lingered near the doorway. "Why me?" she asked softly. "You could have anyone carry your message, anyone with training." The king turned toward the window, the lightning outlining his profile in sharp silver. "Because the moon doesn't bind 2 wolves for nothing. If she chose you, there is a reason. I intend to find out what it is." He looked back at her then, eyes unreadable. "And because you remind me of someone I failed to protect." The words hung between them like a blade. She wanted to ask who, but the sorrow in his gaze stopped her. Some truths, she realized, were heavier than chains. Days passed. Lyra learned the palace by its shadows, the servants who whispered in corners, the guards who watched her with a mix of curiosity and unease, the nobles who lowered their voices when she passed. She moved quietly, listening, collecting fragments of conversation the way she used to collect scraps of bread. The rebellion wasn't far. Smugglers brought news in hushed tones. Ashrend's forces were gathering near the river passes. The stories said he could shift without the moon's call, that his pack was made of wolves who'd sworn to overthrow every alpha throne. But something else surfaced in the rumors, something colder. They spoke of an Omega seer who traveled with Ashrend. a woman whose visions could twist the will of the moon herself. Lyra couldn't explain why the thought made her skin prickle. One evening she returned to her chambers to find the king waiting. He stood by the window, the last light of sunset catching the silver in his hair. "You found something," he said before she could speak. "Maybe," she admitted. "There's talk of an Omega in the rebellion. A seer." His brow furrowed. "Describe her." "No one agrees on how she looks," Lyra said, "but they say she bears the mark of the moon on her wrist. A crescent scar." The king's eyes widened slightly, then shuddered again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, edged with something like fear. "My mother had that mark."
Lyra stared.
"Your mother?" He nodded once. "She disappeared the night I took the throne. The rebels called it liberation. I called it betrayal." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm clouds broke, revealing a single pale moon. Lyra looked at him and realized that beneath the steel and power, he carried wounds of his own, old, unhealed, and just as deep as hers. And for the first time since leaving the slave yards, she didn't feel entirely alone. The rain stopped, but the world still smelled of thunder. By morning the valleys below the palace were wrapped in mist. It clung to the trees like breath that refused to fade. From her window Lyra could see the training grounds, soldiers drilling in neat rows, their shouts echoing off stone. The whole fortress seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for war. She had not slept. The king's words haunted her, the idea that his lost mother, the queen, might still live and now stand against him. If the stories were true, the rebellion seer was more than a whisper of power. She was the living link between the moon and the Pax. And somehow Lyra was caught between them. Varen found her after dawn. "You'll ride with the scouts today," the commander said. "Orders of the king. He wants eyes on the valley road." Lyra tightened the cloak around her shoulders. "He trusts me that much?" Varen's expression didn't soften. "He trusts the moon. That's rarer." The journey down the mountain was harsh. Wet paths, loose stone, the chill of wind through armor. Lyra rode behind the guards, her mind turning with questions she dared not speak. Every tree seemed to hide a secret. Every crow's call sounded like a warning. At the edge of the forest, they dismounted. The commander signaled for silence, then pointed toward a cluster of black banners rising from the fog below. Smoke curled into the sky. Campfires, dozens of them. "The rebellion," one scout whispered. Lyra's pulse quickened. They were closer than anyone had guessed. Then, faintly, a sound drifted through the mist, singing. A woman's voice, low and steady, weaving words she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't a song of war. It was older, a lullaby carried on the wind. Her wolf shivered inside her chest. That night the scouts camped in silence. Varen set double watches, but Lyra couldn't sleep. The song still echoed in her head. When the moon rose high above the trees, she slipped away from the fire and followed the sound. The forest was silver in the moonlight. Leaves glimmered like coins. The air hummed with quiet magic. She moved carefully, every sense alert. At the river's edge she saw her. A woman stood barefoot in the water, her hair long and white as frost, her skin marked with faint lines of silver that glowed in rhythm with her heartbeat. And on her wrist, a crescent scar, shining softly. The seer turned before Lyra could speak. Her eyes were pale gold, unreadable. "You followed the song," she said. Her voice carried the same calm as the river. "I wondered when you would come."
Lyra froze.
"You know me?" "I know what you carry," the seer murmured. "The bond that binds you to the king. The mark that should have been mine." The words struck like a blade of ice. "Yours." The woman stepped closer, the moonlight framing her face. "The moon chooses an heir for every pack. A wolf who carries both alpha strength and omega sight. But the goddess gave that power to another, you. The bond with the king is only half the truth." Lyra shook her head. "That's not possible." The seer smiled faintly. "Then why does your wolf stir when the moon rises? Why does the king's power answer yours? You are not his weakness, child. You are his equal. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. The forest, the river, even the air seemed to hum in agreement. Why tell me this?
Lyra whispered.
Because the war he fears is not against the rebels. The seer's eyes darkened. It is against the chains that bind us all. When the moon turns red, every pack will be tested, and only those who remember mercy will survive. Before Lyra could ask more, the woman stepped back into the mist. The song returned, softer now, fading with the night. By dawn the seer was gone. Lyra returned to camp, shaken, unsure if she had dreamed it. But on her wrist, beneath the cuff of her sleeve, a faint silver crescent now shimmered against her skin. Varen saw it first. You're marked, she whispered. The moon touched you. Lyra pulled the sleeve down quickly. Tell no one. But secrets have their own scent, and by the time they reached the palace, the king was already waiting. He stood in the courtyard, armor glinting beneath the gray sky. You saw her, he said, not a question, a certainty. His gaze fell to her covered wrist. Show me. Lyra hesitated, then drew back the fabric. The mark caught the light like a drop of moonfire. The king's breath left him. So it's true, he said quietly. The moon has chosen again. What does it mean? Lyra asked. He met her eyes, silver to amber. It means the prophecy my father tried to erase has found its voice again, and that every alpha in the realm will now come for you. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of that same song from the valley below. For the first time, Lyra didn't feel like a prisoner or a pawn. She felt the pull of something vast and ancient awakening inside her, something that had been waiting for her to look up at the sky and remember what freedom sounded like. The council chamber smelled of steel and storm. By the time Lyra and the king entered, every noble in Ironfang was already assembled. The news of the moon's mark had moved faster than either of them expected. Now the high table looked less like a seat of power and more like a ring of wolves waiting for the first drop of blood. The king took his throne without a word. Lyra stood a few paces behind, her hands hidden inside her sleeves. Beneath the cloth, the crescent shimmered faintly against her wrist, pulsing like a heartbeat. She could feel eyes drawn to it, the nobles watching, whispering, weighing. At last, Lord Kalen, the oldest of the council, rose. My king, the omen cannot be ignored. The moon's mark reappears after 2 generations, and it lands not on royal blood, but on a slave. He turned his gaze on her, sharp as a blade. Either the goddess mocks us or she warns us. The king's reply came low and steady. The moon does not mock. She corrects. A murmur spread through the room. Kalen's jaw tightened. Then correct me, sire. Will you bind our pack to an untrained Omega with power she cannot control? Or will you protect your throne? Lyra's breath caught. The king's eyes flicked to her, calm but unreadable. Enough, he said. I will not hear another word against her. The mark is proof of her place. She stays under my protection. Kalen bowed slightly. Then let her prove it. The words rippled through the chamber. Prove it, another counselor echoed. Kalen spread his hands. Let the moon herself decide. The blood oath of Ironfang. If she is truly chosen, she will survive the binding flame. Varen stepped forward sharply. That ritual hasn't been used in decades. It could kill her. Kalen smiled thinly. Then we will know the goddess's will. The king's expression darkened, but tradition bound even him. At dusk, he said finally, we end this argument. The ritual took place in the oldest part of the palace, the courtyard built around a well of black stone said to be as deep as the first howl. Torches ringed the circle, their light flickering against rain-slick walls. Every rank of the pack had gathered. Soldiers, nobles, servants, even the children of the palace. Lyra stood at the center, her cloak heavy with rain. Varen tightened the silver cuffs around her wrists. They're supposed to channel the fire, she said quietly. But the pain is real. Don't fight it. Breathe through it. Lyra managed a nod. Her pulse was steady. Fear, strangely, had burned away. All she could think of was the seer's voice, You are not his weakness. You are his equal. The king approached, holding a blade sheathed in flame. It was the oath dagger, forged generations ago, its edge bound to the moon's blessing. He met her eyes. You don't have to do this. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice.
Ido.
He nodded once, then lifted the dagger to the sky. By blood and moonlight, let truth be revealed. The fire leapt from the blade, arcing like liquid light. It struck the stone in a circle around her, flaring high enough to paint the clouds orange. The heat was unbearable. The air roared. Lyra bit back a cry as the cuffs glowed white, and the mark on her wrist blazed to life. The crowd gasped. The fire didn't consume her. It bent, curving toward her skin like a tide drawn by gravity. Threads of light coiled around her arms, weaving patterns that matched the crescent on her wrist. When the last flame faded, the courtyard was silent. Then, from somewhere deep within the earth, a low howl rose, ancient, mournful, full of power. Every wolf in the courtyard dropped to one knee. Even the king bowed his head. The moon had spoken. Lyra stood in the center of the extinguished fire, unharmed. The mark on her wrist shone brighter than ever. Kaelin's voice broke the silence, rough with disbelief.
Impossible.
The king straightened.
No.
The goddess has chosen. Let none speak against her again. Later, when the crowd had gone and the torches burned low, Lyra found herself alone with him in the courtyard. The stones were still warm underfoot. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You changed the fire." "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "It moved on its own." He smiled faintly. "That's how the moons will always feels. Out of control until you learn to listen." She studied him, seeing something different now, not just the warrior king, but the man who carried 1,000 years of duty on his shoulders. "You weren't afraid I would fail." "I was afraid I wouldn't be worthy if you didn't." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Before she could find words, thunder rolled again over the mountains. He looked toward the horizon. "A Shrend won't wait long. The rebellion will see what happened tonight as a sign of war." "And you?" she asked. "I see it as a beginning." He turned away then, leaving her alone with the fading heat of the stones and the knowledge that, somehow, the world had changed its shape around her. By morning, the banners of Iron Fong flew at half-mast. Scouts brought word that the rebellion had crossed the border. The seer's prophecy had begun to unfold. And Lyra, marked by the moon, was no longer just the king's found mate or the slave from the kennels. She was the heart of whatever future waited beyond the next full moon. Dawn came red. The mountains of Iron Fong looked like they were bleeding into the sky, the first light staining the clouds scarlet. In the courtyard below, horns were sounding, low, steady and grim. The rebellion had come. Lyra stood at the window, watching soldiers pour through the gates in disciplined waves. Steel glinted, wolves shifted in flashes of gray and gold fur. The air was alive with the scent of fear and iron. When she turned, the king was already dressed for battle. His armor, polished silver and black, caught the sunrise like flame. "They've taken the outer villages," he said quietly. "A Shren moves faster than we expected." She swallowed. "How many?" "Too many to count." He fastened his cloak, then met her eyes. "Stay inside the inner keep. Varen will guard you." "I can help," she said. The mark on her wrist was glowing faintly, reacting to the chaos beyond the walls. "I feel something, like the moon is waking." He hesitated. For the first time since she'd met him, uncertainty crossed his face. "If you lose control." "I won't." He studied her a heartbeat longer, then nodded once. "Then stay close to me." The first clash came before noon. A Shren's army surged from the forest, banners snapping in the wind, wolves shifting mid-charge. Arrows rained down from the walls. The sound was deafening, metal on metal, claws on stone, the raw music of war. From the battlements, Lyra watched the lines collide. Her pulse matched the rhythm of the drums below. Every cry, every spark of steel pulled at her like threads under her skin. Then the mark on her wrist flared, bright as lightning.
Lira.
Varen shouted, but the sound was already distant. The world slowed. The noise faded. She felt the pull of the moon above, invisible in daylight but burning against her bones. She raised her hand. The light leapt from her fingers in a single arc that struck the ground beyond the gates. Where it touched, the earth shuddered, and the rebels' charge faltered, wolves thrown back as if by an unseen wind. The battlements went silent. Even the king turned in shock.
Lira stumbled, dizzy.
I didn't mean to. He caught her before she fell. Whatever that was, do it again when I say so. The battle dragged into night. Torches flickered over the field. Rain turned the dirt to mud and blood. The king fought at the front, a silver blur in the darkness. Lyra stayed above, her power surging and ebbing with every heartbeat of the moon overhead. At the height of the fight, a new howl split the air, deep, commanding, and full of fury. Ashrend had come. He was massive even in human form, eyes red gold, his armor black as obsidian. When his gaze found the king, the noise of battle dimmed. It ends tonight, brother, he called.
Lira froze.
Brother. The king's sword lowered slightly. You lost that right when you burned our home. Ashrend's smile was cold. And you lost yours when you chained the goddess to a slave. The words hit like a strike. Lyra's stomach twisted. Murmurs rippled through the soldiers on both sides. Then the two brothers charged.
Steel met steel.
Sparks flared. The clash was pure fury. Two forces shaped from the same fire, each trying to erase the other. Lyra wanted to look away, but the bond wouldn't let her. Every strike the king took echoed through her body. Every wound he dealt left her breathless. When Ashrend's blade found a gap in the king's armor, time seemed to tear. Lyra screamed. The mark on her wrist exploded in light. Moonfire rained from the sky. The entire battlefield froze, bathed in silver radiance. Wolves dropped to their knees, howling in awe and terror. The light wrapped around the king, sealing his wound, then flared outward, pushing Ashrend back across the field. When it faded, the rebel alpha was gone, retreated into the forest, his army broken. The night went still. Only the rain remained. In the aftermath, the king turned to her. His face was pale, his armor scorched, but his eyes burned bright. You saved us, he said quietly. Lyra shook her head. The moon did. He reached out, fingers brushing her wrist, where the crescent still glowed faintly.
No.
She chose you to wield her will. Whatever comes next, we face it together. And somewhere far below, in the valley where the rebels fled, a new howl answered, fainter but rising, carrying words that chilled the air. The red moon is coming. Lyra looked up at the sky. Through the clouds, the moon was no longer silver. A faint blush had begun to bloom across its face. The moon bled for 7 nights. Each evening it climbed higher over the Iron Fong Mountains, dimming from silver to rust, from rust to crimson, until even the stars refused to shine beside it. The old wolves whispered that the moon herself wept for what was coming. The palace moved like a creature in pain. Doors slammed, soldiers shouted, the air filled with the sound of preparation and dread. Every shadow seemed longer, every whisper sharper. Lyra stood on the balcony of her chamber, watching the red light stain the valley below. The mark on her wrist pulsed in time with her heartbeat, brighter with every rise of the cursed moon. The power in her veins was changing, growing restless, like the pull of a tide before a storm. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. You shouldn't be alone, said the king. His voice was lower than usual, rough from sleepless nights and command. The battle days ago had left lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but his presence still carried the same gravity, the same quiet strength. I couldn't sleep, she said softly. It feels like the air itself is waiting for something to break. He joined her at the railing, looking out over the dark forests below. Ashrend's army has split. Half retreated east. The rest vanish into the old tunnels under the valley. We can't track them. You think the seer is guiding them? She asked. He nodded. If she truly is my mother, she knows every weakness I have. They stood in silence for a while, the wind cold and dry. The moonlight painted his armor blood red. Lyra finally turned to him. There's something else. When I used the moon's power in the battle, it wasn't just light. I felt minds, hundreds of them. Wolves, human, even a land itself. It was as if everything in Ironfang was connected through the same pulse. He looked at her with quiet intensity. That's the true gift of the mark. The bond doesn't end with us. It reaches through every soul the moon has ever touched. Her breath caught. That's all of them. All, he said simply. Which is why you must learn to command it before the red moon reaches its height. Once it does, the moon's power will test whoever carries her mark. If you can't control it, it will consume you and everyone bound to you. Lyra turned away, staring at her hands. Then teach me. Training began at dawn. The king led her to the Temple of Echoes, the oldest part of the palace, carved deep into the mountainside. Its walls were covered in runes that glowed faintly under torchlight. In the center stood a stone circle, cracked and worn from centuries of use. This place was built by the first marked wolves, he said. The air remembers them. He motioned for her to stand inside the circle. Close your eyes. Listen. She obeyed. The cold stone beneath her feet hummed softly. Slowly, faint whispers began to thread through her mind, voices without bodies, murmurs of memory and time. Now, he said quietly, call the light. At first, nothing. Then a spark, small, trembling but alive. It grew, stretching through her chest and down her arms. The air thickened with silver motes, rising like fireflies. Lyra opened her eyes. Her skin glowed faintly, the mark shining bright enough to cast shadows. Good, he said, stepping closer. But don't force it. Let it breathe through you. She tried to steady her breathing, to ride the rhythm of the magic instead of fighting it. Slowly, she felt the energy thread outward, linking with the stones, the torches, the heartbeat of the mountain itself. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. Then the connection shifted. Images flared behind her eyes, a flash of wolves running beneath a crimson sky, a crown shattering, fire on the snow.
She gasped.
What did you see? He asked. The future, she whispered. And it's burning. The following nights were worse. The red moon climbed higher, and with it came dreams, visions of a world where wolves turned against one another, where the moon's light became a weapon instead of a guide. She woke screaming more than once, the mark searing against her skin. The king never left her side. He sat through the nights without armor or crown, speaking little, only watching as if by sheer will he could hold the world together. On the seventh night, the moon turned its deepest red. The temple bells rang without hands to strike them. The earth trembled. Varen burst into the chamber. They're here, she shouted. The rebels have reached the inner walls. The king rose instantly, grabbing his sword. How many? Hundreds, and Ashrend leads them himself. He looked to Lyra. Stay in the temple. If the red moon wants blood, it will find mine, not yours. But she was already shaking her head.
No.
If the moon's test is coming, it's meant for both of us. He hesitated, then, silently, handed her a dagger. Then we face it together. Outside, the horns of Ironfang sounded again, their echoes swallowed by the roar of battle and the pulse of the crimson moon above. The night sky burned like a wound. The red moon hung low above the palace, its light spilling through the smoke of battle until every stone of Ironfang seemed to bleed. From the high walls, Lyra could see the valley alive with movement, wolves shifting mid-stride, torches wheeling through the mist, steel catching the crimson glow. The air itself shook with the sound of howling. She tightened her grip on the dagger the king had given her. The metal was cold, the mark on her wrist even colder. At the gate, the king's command voice cut through the din. Hold the line. No one crosses the courtyard. His troops answered with a roar, but Lyra saw the fatigue in their movements. Too many wounds, too little time. Then the enemy appeared through the smoke, a Shrend, black-armored, eyes blazing. And beside him, half-veiled by shadow, the white-haired seer. Lyra's heart clenched. The resemblance between the seer and the king was undeniable. The same silver eyes, the same proud stillness. The king saw it too. His expression hardened, but his voice carried grief beneath its strength. "Mother." The seer's answer drifted like wind over ice. "The moon's light does not belong to crowns, my son. You chained her to your throne. I have come to set her free." The ground trembled. A pale beam fell from the crimson moon, splitting the clouds and striking the center of the courtyard. The air twisted. The sound vanished. Lyra felt herself pulled toward it, drawn by the mark on her wrist. The king shouted her name, but she couldn't stop. The magic wanted her, demanded her. When she stepped into the light, the world dissolved. She stood on a plain of silver sand under a sky made entirely of moonlight. The noise of battle was gone. The only sound was her heartbeat, and another, heavier one that matched it exactly. Across the sand stood a Shrend, the king and the seer. The light bound them all together, threads of red and white weaving through the air. The seer's voice echoed from everywhere at once. "This is the trial. When the moon turns red, those who bear her blood must face truth or fall to shadow." Lyra looked down. The mark on her wrist glowed brighter, its light spilling up her arm until it reached her chest. The same glow surrounded the king's heart and Shrend's eyes. "Truth," she whispered. "What truth?" The seer's gaze softened. "The bond you carry is older than choice. One born of war, one born of peace, one born of the in-between. Only when the three see each other without hate will the moon rest." A Shrend laughed, harsh and hollow. "Then the moon will never rest." He lunged at the king, sword raised, but when their blades met, the impact rippled outward, striking Lyra like a shockwave. Pain flooded her senses. She saw flashes of memory that weren't hers. Children running through snow. Two young brothers sparring under a pale moon. A woman's laughter. Then fire. Screams. The crown falling into blood. She gasped, realizing the truth behind the rebellion. A Shrend had not betrayed first. He had watched his mother taken by soldiers who called it loyalty to the new king. The hatred had been born from grief. The vision faded. The brothers stood panting, weapons locked. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Lyra stepped between them. "Enough," she said. "This isn't the moon's will, it's yours. You've both been fighting ghosts." The king lowered his sword slightly.
"Lyra."
"No," she said, voice shaking but firm. "You want to save your pack. He wants to save what's left of your family. And the moon, she wants both." The mark on her wrist flared again, bright enough to wash out the red sky. Light spilled from her palms, wrapping around the three of them like threads spun from silver and flame. The seer raised her arms. "Then show me mercy, child of the moon." Lyra closed her eyes and let the light expand until it swallowed everything: pain, anger, sound. For one breathless moment, she felt every heartbeat in Ironfang, every wolf calling for peace, every echo of the goddess herself. When the light faded, she was back in the courtyard. The red had drained from the moon. It shone silver again. The soldiers stood dazed, weapons lowered. A soft rain began to fall, washing the blood from the stones. A Shrend knelt on the ground, his armor cracked. The king stood over him, sword lowered but not drawn to strike. "Brother," the king said quietly, "the war ends here." A Shrend met his gaze, something breaking behind the anger. Then he nodded once and let the weapon fall. The seer stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "The moon chose well," she murmured to Lyra. "Guard what you have awakened." And with the first light of dawn, she was gone, fading like mist into the forest. For the first time in years, Ironfang was silent. Lyra looked up at the returning silver moon and felt its light settle warm on her skin. The mark no longer burned. It pulsed gently, steady as a heartbeat. The king came to stand beside her. "What happens now?" she asked. He sheathed his sword. "Weary build." And we remember that power without mercy is just another kind of cage. Lyra nodded, the wind catching her hair, carrying away the last echoes of war. Somewhere deep in the valley, wolves howled again, not in defiance this time, but in harmony. The world had turned, and the moon was watching. The war ended not with a roar, but with a silence that felt like breathing after years underwater. For days the valley lay quiet beneath the soft light of a cleansed moon. The banners that once marked enemy lines were torn down and burned, their ashes scattered to the wind. The wolves of Iron Fang began to rebuild, one stone, one heartbeat at a time. Lyra walked through the ruined courtyard where the final battle had been fought. The stones still bore faint scorch marks, but new grass was pushing through the cracks. Every sound, the hammer of builders, the bark of commands, the laughter of cubs, felt fragile, precious. She knelt, pressing her palm to the ground. The soil was warm. The moon's power, once violent and wild inside her, had softened into something steady. She could feel life stirring under her hand, the heartbeat of the pack, the rhythm of a world learning to heal. Behind her came the sound of footsteps she knew better than her own. "You should rest," said the king. He no longer wore armor. The weight of war had been replaced by a simpler strength. The silver in his hair caught the morning light. He looked, for the first time, not like a monarch forged in battle, but like a man who had finally come home. "I wanted to see it," she said. "The place where everything changed." He stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back. It was never meant to happen this way. The moon's trial, the rebellion, the mark, none of it. "Maybe it was," Lyra said softly. Maybe she knew the only way to break the old cycle was to burn it. They stood together in silence, watching as the first sunlight touched the far peaks. The air smelled of pine and rain, not blood. In the weeks that followed, Iron Fang changed. Ashren's soldiers laid down their arms and were offered a choice: exile or oath. Most chose the latter. The king kept his word, rebuilding the pack as one people instead of ranks divided by birth or strength. Varen was given command of the new guard. Her first order was to strike the word slave from the palace records forever. Lyra spent her days in the old temple, learning to read the runes that lined the walls. The moon's mark allowed her to hear the echoes of every wolf who had come before, stories of creation, of the first packs, of the promises that had shaped their kind. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night with the words of those long-gone voices still on her tongue, and she would write them down, line by line, to preserve them. The people began calling her the Moonkeeper. One evening, near the end of summer, she stood again on the palace balcony. The moon was full, clean silver now, washing the valley in soft light. She could see the torches of distant villages twinkling like stars. The world felt wide again, alive again. The king joined her, his presence familiar, grounding. "Do you still hear her?" he asked quietly. "Always," she said. "But she's quieter now. It's like she's listening instead of speaking." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps she finally trusts us to find our own way." Lyra turned to him. "And will you? Find your way?" He met her gaze, eyes steady. "I will try. But I would rather not do it alone." There was no command in his words this time, no weight of destiny. Only an invitation. She didn't answer right away. The bond between them no longer burned. It pulsed gently, steady as the rhythm of the moon above them. Not a chain, but a choice. At last she said, "Then we begin again. Not as king and Omega, as equals." He nodded once, and together they looked out at the valley, their home, their scar, their beginning. When dawn broke, the moon sank pale and small behind the mountains, giving way to a sky of gold. The wolves of Iron Fang howled to greet the day, their voices rising in one long, unbroken note of peace. Lyra closed her eyes and let the sound wash through her. The mark on her wrist glimmered once, then faded into skin, its purpose fulfilled. For the first time in her life, she felt no chains, no commands, no destiny waiting to swallow her whole. Only freedom, only light, only the promise of a silver dawn. Under the silver dawn, the war was over. But some stories don't end. They evolve. The slave who became the moon's chosen, the king who learned mercy, the brothers bound by blood and forgiveness. Their world now breathes again, fragile, free, and waiting for what comes next. If this tale touched you, if you felt the fire, the heartbreak, and the hope, then join us. Subscribe for more dark fantasy love stories, where fate burns bright, hearts defy destiny, and even the shadows can fall in love with the light.
This is your world now.
Welcome to the pack.